Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly feature, we talk about editing photographs, and we talk about doing it in Lightroom specifically, but pretty much any kind of image editing, the concepts will apply. We've been talking for months now about global edits, and it's time to move into local edits. And I think that that's the most powerful thing that you can do with image editing, and I think that's where your own personal style really can come through. So just to review, the global edits affect everything within the photo. So if this screen is what we're talking about, every adjustment that we make is going to affect every portion of this in some way or another. Doing local edits, we can basically isolate a subject, or in this case a person. It's hard to do this backwards. We can look at the background and not affect the subject. We can change certain aspects to our liking without affecting the other aspects at all. So that is where the power of local editing really comes into play. And we're going to kind of do this in a two-step process to introduce the local edits, because there's a lot of different ways of doing the masks, and I want to introduce the masks before I get into anything else. So today we're going to go ahead and jump over into Lightroom, and we're going to look at this one picture, and we're not dealing anything at all with global edits at this point. This is a final version of the picture. But I do want to show you what the local edits have done, and then we're going to talk about some of the masks. And the masks are just the ways of defining the areas that we're going to be talking about. So if you go over here under the histogram, the first box here is going to be basically the editing tab. That gets you all of these tabs right here for the global edits. You've got the crop tool. You've got the remove tool, which we talked about recently. Red eye reduction, which I don't plan on talking about. I've never once used that. But this last one, this disc right here, this is your masking tool. And if you click that, this box opens up, and these are the masks that I have applied. So these are the local edits that I have gone through and worked on this image. And you can kind of see from the picture over to the side, the area that is in white is what has been affected by each one of these masks. I don't want to get ahead of myself and start getting into details about what I have done in each mask, so we're not going to worry about that part right now. What I do want to show you, though, is what this does, because the local adjustments will direct how the eyes go within the scene. So if we go up here to this eyeball next to masks and we left click that, that takes the local adjustments away. This is what the global edit looked like on this picture. I like it, but the eyes tend to go too far into the background because the eyes go to what is brightest in the scene first. I didn't want them to go that far into the background. So I've done these local edits, and you can see now that this area is the brightest. I've darkened the sky, I've darkened the foreground, and we've made this area right here the focal point. So let's go and look at that again. With no local adjustments, with local adjustments. This is where the power of your post-processing really will come in. So just for the sake of argument, I'm going to delete all of these masks. And don't worry, this is a virtual copy, so I've still got my master file in place. But when you first go into the mask, it has add a new mask. And you have select subject, sky, and background. Those are some of the AI affected masks. And they're very effective in some cases they are not. For instance, in this one, we don't necessarily have a defined main subject. But if we click on subject, it's going to try, it says no subject detected. I expected that to happen. That's not a problem. If we do sky, let's see what happens. And it'll just kind of do its little thing as it's looking for the sky, and we've got some hazy mountains here in the background that may cause it a problem. And as you see, it does bleed over into the mountains. These masks are not ideal, but you can adjust them. And just for the sake of argument here, and we're going to get a little ahead of ourselves, if we do the sky and we don't want these mountains in place, we can do subtract. Come down here, we can just freehand a brush. And I've got the brushes set up. We'll get to it in a minute. But we can go and remove that mask from the areas we don't want it. So there are ways that we can manipulate these easy masks to do. But honestly, for this one, I don't like selecting the sky. So I'm just going to delete this mask. We don't really have a background. Background is really good when you are differentiating between subject and background, or a person and a background. So there's really no background here. So we're going to go down, and since we started with the sky, I'm going to show you a better way of doing the sky, because I do like the way that this recedes into the distance with the haze, the fog, and the atmosphere. So what I generally like to do for skies is do a linear gradient. And this works just like an ND grad filter on your camera. It pops this dialog box up and it says new mask. We know it's a new linear gradient. And then we have this plus on the screen. So we can left click, and that's going to activate this mask. And then we drag away from where we want the effect to be applied. So we drag down, and what is in green is going to be affected by this mask. What is not will not. And if you want to keep it level and you don't want to have it skewed like this, press shift on your keyboard, and that's going to lock it in to a vertical or horizontal orientation. It won't skew diagonally. So about there is what I would like. So release that left click, and this locks the mask in, but you can take this handle and you can move it up and down. Now there are 3 lines here. This is the center point. This is that middle point between the effects, and then the distance between these 2 is the feather, and that is how gradually this takes effect. So if we shrink this, it's a very, very small feather, and you're going to see the effect very quickly. If we stretch it out, it makes it very gradual. And as you see, we can maneuver this however we want to. And let's just say we want to darken the sky. We're not going to get into adjustments, but I just want to show you what that feather does. And once you start making adjustments, that green goes away and you see the picture for what it is. So now you can really dial it in. But you see, even with a 1.5 stops difference, we've got this large feathering here, so it's a very gradual transition. If I reduce that feather, see, that no longer looks natural. I can still move it all around. I can do whatever. I can go over here, get this little twisty turny arrow, and I can make this diagonal. And if I get it in the wrong way, I can actually go and flip it just by turning this around. So it's very easy to work with, and this is one of those masks that I spend a lot of time with. I really like the linear gradient. And you can do all kinds of things with it. So think of that as a ND grad or a color grad, because you can adjust colors. Everything that we've been working with globally, we can work with over here with very few exceptions, and there's a couple of additions that we can do over global. So we're looking at Up here in the tone, we can do exposure, contrast, highlight, shadow, whites, blacks. All those things we've adjusted in the global edits, we can do those here in local. Color, we can do temperature, tint, we can change the hue, we can change the saturation. There's a little letterbox here which we're going to get into, and we can make a color effect. Point color, which we have talked about in with the HSL panel. We don't have access to the HSL panel, but we do have access to this point color, which we talked about before. We'll get into that again. One of the recent updates allows us to do the tone curve locally. I love this option. We can do the luminance tone curve, and we can go into the RGB channels for the tone curve. We've also got the effects, the texture, clarity, dehaze, which we can do, same thing we can do globally, but I find it a whole lot more effective to do it locally. Grain, that's a new one. We can add grain in a certain part of an image. I'm not a big fan of that, but I'm sure that there are valid reasons for using that. I know that that was a welcome addition to Photoshop or to Lightroom. So we'll talk about that. It's not something that I use, but it's there. But we've also got a detail tab where we can adjust sharpness locally. This is really good in certain situations like doing a portrait where you sharpen the eyes. We can reduce noise. So if you are working a particular area and you're bringing a lot of information out of the shadows, you can reduce noise specifically to that area. The Moray, that's a really good one, especially for me. My chosen camera, the 5DSR, has a problem with these really fine repeating patterns like in fabrics, and it just makes some weird stuff. And I'll get a good example of that when we get to that point, but that's one that I use some in my portrait work, and it's very effective. Defringing, this is talking about the chromatic aberrations, and you can do this locally as well as globally. So all of these areas right here can be affected locally. So let's just go ahead and talk about one other thing on this. Since we overcooked the sky here, we darkened it too much, let's just say that we had 5 or 6 different sliders. We like the effect, but it is too much. A new addition in Lightroom is we have an amount slider. So we can dial this effect back. Once we get it kind of set with the recipe that we like, we just want to adjust the serving size. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I like that. But we can bring that serving size back to 58%. And now it is much more subtle. And now maybe it fits better, but we like the combination. Now, if it's just we're messing with exposure, we just dial the exposure to where we need it. That's simple. If we want to go more, we can dial this effect up 158. But again, it gives us the ability to do some different things with the masks. So once we get that mask set, and let's just say we like that mask, you can double click here where it says mask 1, and that's going to bring up a rename box. This is something I like to do just to help keep things organized. Make that sky, and it replaces that mask name up here. So we want to continue working. We're going to create a new mask, and let's just go down the list so we can keep it all nice in order. We're not doing an edit, so I'm not worried about that. We've talked about select subject. We'll get to that in another Tuesday's tips. Select sky, we've talked about. Background, there is no background here. Select people, there's no people. There might be in this little house right here, but we're probably not going to be able to mask them out. Objects. This is kind of a catch-all mask, and it's one that I think is underutilized because those that have been using Lightroom for a long time, myself included, don't think about doing it this way. We've found other ways of masking things that we like, but if we do objects, look over here on the right-hand stack. This top part here will always be the way that you customize the mask. We can do a brush tool where we paint over things, or we can do this basically marquee tool. For objects that are square or rectangle in nature, that marquee tool works really good because you come in and you just draw that. Now let's see what happens. It's going to try to detect it. And it did not do a bad job. Even though the marquee tool had over here, we did get the rock, and that's what I was aiming for. But let's try it a different way. We're going to delete that mask, create a new mask, object, and we're going to do the brush tool. We're going to freehand draw this thing. You can take this brush size, you can either adjust it here, you can do the bracket keys on the keyboard, or I like doing the wheel on my mouse. It's already right there under my finger, and I can adjust the size like I want it. And just kind of do a rough outline of the object that you want. Now in this situation, there's a lot of different textures, so I want to make sure I get everything, so I'm going to go in and just highlight everything. Now, if it's fairly uniform, just get the outline and you're good. It'll fill in the rest. So we're going to let it detect, we're going to let it work, and it kind of did the same thing. But at this point, we've got a pretty good edge, so I can go up here, click Mask 1, Add, and like we did with the sky, only this time I'm adding instead of subtracting, we can go down to Brush, and we'll talk more about the brush here in a little while. But there we go. Now we've got this rock figured out. So everything is black and white. The way I have it set up, I've got this green highlight to show me what the mask is affecting. I want to make the rock a little brighter. Okay, I want to add a little bit of clarity. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to double click here, foreground, rock. So that's kind of how to use object. So let's try something else. And now's a good time as any to do brush. Now, like I said, this top part here is a way of fine-tuning the mask. I have things set up in Lightroom a specific way for me. Do this how you like. Lightroom gives you the option of 2 brushes, and I don't think that Camera Raw within Photoshop does this. I think you have to set the brushes independent each time you use them. I have an A brush set up with a whole lot of feather, so it's very gradual. Remember that feather is the transition between the effect and not the effect. I have the flow drop down to 30%, so I can build this effect up. Density, I generally keep it at 100. That's kind of like it's related to flow, and it's how quickly the effect is put down. If I'm doing retouching on a person, I may drop that down a good bit, so it is very gradual. But generally, I keep the density at 100, the flow at 30, so I can build it up, and it will eventually be a full effect if I wanted it to be that way. There's also auto mask. And what auto mask will do is it will help decide where the lines and divisions are, and it will keep you from coloring outside of the lines. Now, of course, the more random the divisions are, the more difficult that's going to be. Like if I wanted to just affect the foreground rhododendron here and keep it separate from the trees in the background, that would be kind of difficult because it's similar tones, similar textures, similar colors. So Lightroom is going to have a real hard time differentiating. But that is something that is there. It works really good when those edges are present. But my A brush is set up to build the effect. My B brush, on the other hand, has a little bit harder of a feather, and you can see in the brush tool there's less room between the effect and the outside where there is no effect. So it's a little bit more abrupt. My flow is at 100%, and this is when I am really working on getting an object, and I want 100% of the effect to be applied to that object. I usually have my auto mask applied, density as at 100. So let's see how that works with my B brush for 100%, auto mask set. You see how it's doing a pretty good job of finding that line of the rock? And I just kind of go along here, and it's kind of like doing the object mask. And now that I've got the edge pretty much established, I can uncheck auto mask. And now I don't have to worry about missing some of the texture within the rock. So this is giving me 100% on the rock. And let's just say I made a boo-boo and I colored outside of the lines, and my Crayolas got taken away from me, and my construction paper was put back in the box so I can no longer eat it and play with the paste later on. Yeah, I was that kid. But if we do that, we'll notice that erase is now highlighted. Anytime we add a brush mask on here, we're going to have the option of hitting erase. Same things apply. We can do the feather, we can do the flow. And for erase, generally I want to erase the whole effect. We'll keep the auto mask on because I want to keep this line. Make the brush bigger with the wheel on the mouse, or you can do it with the bracket keys on the keyboard. And just drag over what you want erased. And you see we've got that line back, and now I can just go ahead and finish erasing the rest. And if you see, there's a little bit of green right around in here. That's that auto mask. So once you get that edge defined, take the auto mask off and you can clean up the rest of it. Very simple to do. If you need to see a better version of what you have affected, click the little three dots here, and where it says, mask overlay mode, try white on black. And this will show you exactly where your mask is being applied. And you can see kind of the splotches of texture here, and that's thanks to that auto mask on the rock. If you had to clean that up, you could go in at this point, select B, which is the 100% flow, take auto mask off, and now you can go in and work these areas out if that is important to you. Same thing where the feather kind of didn't do me any favors through these areas, we can clean that up. So we can come back here and we can do a color overlay, which is everything's in color. What we're masking is in green. We can change the color by clicking that and make it whatever color we like. I think it defaults to red. I like green, but since I do a lot of landscape stuff, the green kind of gets in my way a little bit. So I'll do a color overlay on black and white. And that takes all the color out of the picture, so I know whatever's green, I'm going to be affecting. Again, we do have the amount slider. Well, oddly enough, on the brush tool, it's not giving me the amount slider, but generally speaking, on the masks, that does work. With the brushes, if I'm needing to adjust the amount, I will usually do a gradual build-up. So let's go in and look at the other brush tool, and let's say we're going to do the A brush, which is the 30% flow. I don't need the auto mask. I want to bring this area up in exposure. Now, unlike doing that B brush where everything is 100% affected, I want to see what I'm doing, because as I add the effect, and you see it's faint, I don't really know how this is working. That doesn't do me any good at all. So I'm going to erase everything that I just did. We need to figure out a way to see what we're doing. So we're going to dial in a half a stop of extra light. And let's see, and we'll go right there. We're on this brush that we're adding in exposure. So now I'm going to left click with this nice big brush. Oh, I still want to erase. See, it's hard to talk through this and do it. It's easier when you just do what's natural. But we're in the A brush, 30% flow. Auto mask is off. I've got a lot of feather going on. So we're going to make that brush as big as we need, and I am just going to start going over these areas. And we're at 30% flow with only adding a half of a stop. So what we're doing is very gradual, and we just kind of hit the areas that we want. And you see, I went over areas several times. And if we look, we hover over that mask, you can see where my mask is. You can see the intensity of where I put multiple layers and where I put fewer layers. So that's where we're at. And for this kind of adjustment, I won't usually go more than about a half a stop, because that's what I feel works very well. It gives me enough to where I can see the difference, but not so much that it becomes obvious, and I can build that effect up. But if I like what I've got and I want to bring it up a little bit more, here's that amount slider. I can make it a little bit more intense. I can bring it back down. So that is where we're at on the brushes. Brushes are very handy. It's kind of like the object mask. You can go in and you can mask anything that you want with a brush. You can do it in different varying degrees of intensity, which I like. Again, you go in, rename, double click on there, flowers, hit OK, and boom. Mask 1, rock 2, because it was our second adjustment on the rock. So there you go. So that's how to use the brush tool. And I will say it is very easy to use the brush tool with a Wacom tablet, and that's one of these little guys right here, if you can see down in the corner. I prefer to do all of my brush work with that. I'm not going to get it going right now just because I'm doing loose and quick things. But we've talked about the linear gradient. Now let's talk about my next favorite one that we can do, and that's the radial gradient. This is the one that, other than the linear, I get the most use out of. And a radial gradient works kind of like a linear. We get this little plus deal up here, and we go somewhere around where we want this effect to be. We left click and we drag, and we make this circle, this oval. And we can change the size by going left to right, up to down. We cannot make it diagonal yet. But once we get a shape that we like, go up here on the edge, and you see where I've got that double arrow? I can now rotate this wherever I want. And these handles at noon, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock, we can drag this in, we can change how this looks. The two circles here, just like with the brush tool, just like with the linear gradient, this is the feather. This is where all of our effect is getting applied. This is the feather point to where the effect is not getting applied. This red handle here adjusts the amount of feather. So if we want a lot of feather here, we want a gradual change with what we're doing, we can do that here. Or up here at the top where we fine-tune these, there is the same feather. And we can make it no feather. And if we do that, and let's say we want to add a little bit of exposure. Okay, that looks real natural, doesn't it? So let's start bringing the feather in. And you see how it softens that side. And as we build that feather up, we get to where we can barely see the effect. But when we come up here and we hit the eyeball, it makes a huge difference. But we can't see the effect to look at it. That's the key. That's the trick with doing these local adjustments. You want to make sure that you have enough feather to where the effect is not noticeable as a change. You want everything to be gradual. And we can do this, like I said, on both sides equally, or if you do Alt or Option on a Mac, you can drag just that one handle and you can change the shape slightly. So when you're really getting it fine-tuned or want to get the shape a certain way, you can do this with doing Alt or Option. Most of the time though, just doing that where it affects both sides is actually a little bit quicker. But that's the radial tool, and I love doing this radial tool. It works for landscapes, it works for old car pictures, it works for people, it works for architecture, it works for just about anything. The radial and the linear are the two that you will use the most. Object and brush are going to be very useful for isolating certain elements also. But I will point this out. Remember when we defined this rock? A lot of times we want to have a little bit of a feather so we don't have the rock looking a whole lot brighter than, say, just beyond the rock. So this feather from the radial coming out here is going to make the rock brighter. And we can just go ahead and pull this down here, make the rock brighter, but it's also going to bleed some of that brightness to this area here, so it helps blend that element. We still get that brightening here, but we're blending the element here. So we've got almost a half a stop of difference here, not a whole lot, but if we take the eyeball, you see how we're affecting the brightness just beyond the rock as well, but we're also keeping the eyes focused over here. So that is a way to do this, and a way that the radial can help. Same thing applies up here with the rhododendron. You don't want to just apply this mask to the flowers. You want to get a nice little feather so it blends. And let's see, we'll just rename this to pink flowers. I'm not worried about spelling or the typo. But remember when we talked about effects and we were talking about vignetting. We can create a new mask, come down to radial gradient. We can make a really, really big gradient. It covers the whole thing. Bring this feather down. And just so we can see what's going on, go up here to your navigator and do 6%. You see we are well outside. But go over here to this fine tuning and you'll see an invert box. An invert is there on, I think, just about every mask. So once you establish a mask like we have with this radial, 100% of the effect here, and then it feathers all the way out here. If we hit invert, now 100% of the effect is outside and it feathers into no effect here. So we are essentially creating another vignette. And we can change that feather, we can put that focal point right over where we want, come back over here to fit, and now we drop the exposure. We are now bringing the exposure down in the photo except this area right here, and we're doing it feathered. So it's very, very gradual, and it's almost like the sun is just hitting these flowers. So that's invert, and we'll call that one vignette. But you'll notice that vignette is not centered. When we do it through the effects tab, it's always going to be centered. We can adjust the shape and the feather, but it's always going to be centered. This is a custom vignette based exactly where I want it to be. And of course, this is a very heavy-handed edit. The sky's way too dark, this is way too bright, but you get the idea of what these things will do. So let's go to a different mask. Let's do another introduction here. Let's do color range. Okay, with color range, when you come out here, now instead of the plus, you have a medicine dropper. Let's say I want to deal with the pink rhododendron flowers. I'm going to left click and I'm going to draw a box over the flower so I get all those pink tones. And now you see what happens. We've got the pink tones. These are also similar tones. They're similar tones in the sky. But if we come over here and do refine, we can go to the left and we can reduce the amount of overflow on those tones. So now we're only going to be affecting those flowers. And we've essentially taken everything out now by bringing the refining down to 7. So now we can add saturation to the flowers. Just a local edit just on these flowers. And if we click the eyeball, you can see that saturation made a huge difference and just applied to those. So we'd rename that, we'd move on. Let's look at another one, luminance range. And we talked about this one early on because I did the easy way to dodge and burn. But with luminance range, again, you have this medicine dropper here, and we can say, let's get some of the brighter midtones. And you see by clicking that, it kind of highlights those tones. And if you come over here, this is absolute black, this is absolute white, this is the area, it's the midtones, and then we have the feather on either side of it. So I can bring the feather in, get rid of some of those shadows. I can bring the feather in here, get rid of some of the shadows, or I can stretch the feather all the way over to the brighter areas. This is not a great picture to show the usefulness of this, but it is there. And you come in and you can adjust, the exposure or whatever it is that you want to do. Season this to taste. The way that I will usually use the luminance range is it's going to come up, it's going to kind of be everything. And let's just say I want to only affect the bright areas. And this is that dodging. Something like that. And I want to bring those up a little bit. I'll make the areas brighter. Add more contrast. So there we go. We're going to make this dodge. And that's, what, third of a stop. This is the area that's being affected. This is the feather. And you can see in the green how that works. We're going to create a new mask. Luminance range. Same thing. We've got this whole box here. We're going to take the highlights out. We're going to come down and only do the dark. So deep shadows and the black tones are going to be affected. We can adjust the feather, but I like where this is. We're going to make those areas a little darker. So we're going to drag this down a quarter of a stop. Just deepens the shadows just a little bit, but it's a very specific way of doing it. It's not like doing the global shadows and highlights. So we'll double click here and we'll do burn because we just burned those details in. So going up to the new masks, we've talked about everything. Depth range is not available on my camera. I've yet to see anything that I've shot come out with a depth range, but it will establish kind of this is what's foreground, this is midground, this is background. I haven't gotten any use out of that. Don't know how usable that is, but it is something that Lightroom has made available. So we've kind of covered everything here. Do remember that you have the ability to invert these masks. Okay. And we went down here, we did the brush on rock 2. And again, nothing is destructive in Lightroom. We can go and we can change these. We can say, okay, I'm going to add a little bit more exposure here. I'm going to make more contrast, drop the highlights, whatever we want to do to the rock. We can do all that later just by going and clicking back on these masks. Don't forget the invert. We can do that afterwards. Obviously, that's not the effect that we want in the background, but it is there. You have the ability to add and subtract. And we've talked about that. We can add brushes, or we can go in and say, I want to add a radial gradient, and say, I want to put that effect over here. So there we go. I just added the same effect up here. Not something that I would suggest that you do, but if you have an area that you want to multiply and duplicate, you can do that. You can also right-click and you can duplicate radial gradient 1. So you can do that same effect and you can move it over somewhere else. You can resize that one specific. So we have a duplicate radial here to what we have here as far as effect, but we have sized it for what we need and want. A lot of different things that we can do. We can subtract areas. If I wanted to split that difference, I could come up here and do the linear gradient, and that's going to subtract the areas from those radial filters. So now, if we hover over here, we can see what's going on and what's being affected, what's not being affected. There is also, you can do Alt or Option on a Mac over the add and subtract, and it's going to be intersect. What this does, and we're just going to make a new mask just to make this simple. We're going to do a radial gradient, and we are going to cover the rhododendron. Don't need much feather, and I'm going to show you why. But I don't want to do all this. I just want to affect the pink, because you remember when we identified the pink, it started picking the rock, started picking part of the sky. If I go over here and hit intersect, I can come down and pick color range. So now I'm going to intersect it with the pink of the flower. We can still refine it, but if we've got a highly complex scene and we need to isolate a certain portion of it, we can do it by establishing the radial gradient, intersecting it with a color range, meaning that color range is only going to apply within that radial gradient. If we added the color range, it's going to add any of the colors beyond that radial gradient. If we subtract it, it's going to subtract that color. We could have subtracted the greens from the radial and it kind of would have done the same thing, but I wanted it to be more specific, and the more specific was intersecting it with that pink. So that would be how you adjust the different masks and get the area masked that you want. Now when you're done with the masks, you can hit the tab here that goes back to edit. That makes the masks go away. They're still there. To go back, you click that disk, and there are all of our masks. You can move this dialog box to the other side if you need to, put it here, wherever it is out of your way. So that's a handy thing. Then just dock it back. Then we can go back, and again we can adjust all of our basic tabs. Everything that we've done globally, we can still adjust. We can adjust the global edits. Now, if you go and do some kind of healing after you have done masks, let's just say I'm going to do a healing brush right there. Now, that's probably going to look really, really funky, but it's going to show what I need it to show. Okay, we did that. We're happy. But we're going to end up with a problem. Let's see. Yeah, I did do a AI, I think. A lot of times, I don't think I did an AI mask on here, but if you've done masks and you do something with the cloning healing and it affects one of the masks, you're going to get a red dot under here. So just go back and click on any of these where this little 3 dot is, and it says update AI masks. Left click that, it'll update it, the red dot goes away, and everything is good. So that is kind of our start to masks, and we're going to get into some detail with it. But I just wanted to introduce you to how the masks work. Next week we're going to look at the masks on the level of a portrait where we have a person, a subject. We can go in and do the individual elements of a person. There's a lot of different things that we can do with these masks, and I'm just kind of getting you an overview. We're going to go into detail on how each one of them works, how we can manipulate an image. So look forward to that starting again next week, and don't forget, I do offer mentoring. So if this is something that you want to delve into deeper and want to do it one-on-one, I can do this virtually. I can do it in person for those that are in the foothills of North Carolina, but virtually works very well. I'll leave links to that in the description. So until next week, happy shooting, happy editing, and I look forward to talking with you again. Take care.